For months, I kept seeing the same pattern repeat itself across the scientific literature. Different studies, different populations, different countries, but all pointing toward the same place. The water you drink every morning could be working against you, or it could become the most powerful and inexpensive intervention you've ever made. And the difference between those two outcomes isn't the water itself. It's three compounds that almost nobody adds that cost pennies a day, and whose absence the scientific evidence now links to a chain of deterioration that begins silently in the fifth decade of life. I'm Dr. Becker, a physician focused on functional medicine and preventive aging. What I'm about to share comes from years of reviewing peer-reviewed research following the science wherever it leads, not wherever it's convenient for it to go. Before we go any further, I need to be clear about something important. What you're about to hear is educational information based on published scientific research. It is not a substitute for personalized medical care. If you have kidney disease, heart disease, cancer, or are under any form of medical treatment, please work with your doctor before making any changes to your routine. There are people for whom some of these interventions are contraindicated, and we're going to address that with precision before we get to the protocol. Today, I'm walking you through the full investigation. You're going to understand what happens to your body's internal environment while you sleep, why that matters more than anyone has told you, and which three specific compounds have clinical trial support for protecting your kidneys, modulating the environment where cancer tries to grow, and activating the cellular renewal processes that weaken after 50. By the end, you'll have a concrete protocol with exact doses, the studies behind them, and clear boundaries about who this works for and who needs to modify it first. If you find value in this kind of research, subscribing helps me keep digging into topics like this. No pressure, I just mention it because that's how this works. Let me start with something that happens in your body every night while you sleep, something most physicians never bring up in a routine visit. During 7 or 8 hours of sleep, your body loses between 400 and 800 milliliters of water just from breathing. The humid you exhale, minimal perspiration, overnight urine. That's not a trivial amount. It's nearly 2 full glasses of water that disappear while you're unconscious. And when you wake up in that state, your body doesn't register it as slightly thirsty. It registers it as osmotic stress, a threat that triggers a hormonal cascade with real consequences throughout the rest of the day. The first system to respond is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, what we commonly call the stress axis. When blood osmolarity rises from dehydration, the hypothalamus releases vasopressin, also known as antidiuretic hormone. Vasopressin tells the kidneys to retain water, basic physiology we've understood for decades. But what the most recent research has clarified is the direct connection between elevated vasopressin and the cortisol axis. A study published in the Journal of Applied Physiology in 2025 examined this relationship specifically in adults with habitually low fluid intake. Participants with the lowest hydration levels show significantly greater cortisol reactivity to the same stress stimulus compared to their well-hydrated counterparts. The test used was the Trier Social Stress Test, one of the most validated standards in stress response research. This wasn't casual correlation. Hydration directly affects the amplitude of the cortisol response. Why does that matter at 600 in the morning? Because cortisol already has its own natural peak upon waking. What researchers call the cortisol awakening response, or CAR. This morning cortisol spike is normal and necessary. It helps us activate, mobilizes glucose for the brain, prepares the immune system for the day. The problem is when that spike is exaggerated by overnight dehydration. When you arrive at it already dehydrated, cortisol climbs higher than it should, lasts longer than it should, and generates a cascade of metabolic consequences. Elevated blood glucose in the morning, even though you haven't eaten anything, inflammatory signaling activated before breakfast, muscle tissue beginning to catabolize as an emergency energy source. In people over 50, this has an additional dimension that chronobiology research has documented clearly. The circadian rhythm of cortisol advances with age. The peak arrives earlier and the downregulation is lower. Older adults have a longer window of elevated morning cortisol than younger adults. According to data from the MIDO study, a longitudinal study that has followed thousands of participants for decades, that means the potential damage of starting the day dehydrated accumulates faster and over a longer period in the age group that is already most vulnerable to its downstream effects on cardiovascular health, insulin resistance, and cognitive function. But there's another process happening during those same hours of sleep that has even deeper implications. And to understand it, I need to introduce you the main actor in cellular renewal, autophagy. Autophagy is the process by which your cells perform internal cleanup. They identify damaged organelles, misfolded proteins, mitochondria that no longer function properly, and disassemble them to recycle their components. When this process works correctly, cells stay younger and functional for longer. When it deteriorates, cellular debris accumulates, and that is one of the fundamental mechanisms of accelerated aging and multiple chronic diseases. Autophagy is regulated primarily by two proteins that function as antagonists, EMPK and mTOR. EMPK is the cell's energy sensor. It activates when available energy is low during fasting, during sleep, and says, "Cleanup isn't working. Be efficient." mTOR does the opposite. It activates when there's an abundance of nutrients, especially proteins and glucose, and says, "Build, grow, produce." When you eat, mTOR activates and suppresses autophagy. When you fast, EMPK takes control and autophagy flourishes. The overnight sleep period is by biological design's watch. While you fast for 8 hours drives autophagy, cells perform their deepest cleaning, and stem cells receive maintenance signals that preserve their regenerative capacity. A systematic review published in Cell Regeneration in April 2025 analyzed decades of research on this axis and concluded that autophagy is indispensable for adult stem cell homeostasis, and that its decline with aging is one of the central mechanisms of stem cell exhaustion, which is precisely one of the 9 hallmarks of aging described by Lopez-Alden and colleagues in their landmark paper, published in Cell in 2013. Here is the piece that connects all of this to your first sip of water in the morning. When you wake up, you are at the point of peak EMPK activation. Autophagy has been working for hours. Cellular cleanup is at its peak. Stem cells are receiving maintenance signals. That is the moment, precisely that moment, when the magnesium you have available in circulation determines whether EMPK can continue functioning properly for the next 90 minutes until breakfast activates mTOR and closes that window. The problem is that magnesium in adults over 50 is frequently in deficit. This isn't speculation. Data from the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, the NHANES, consistently show that more than 50% of American adults fail to meet the estimated average requirement for magnesium from their diet. In adults over 50, the situation is worse for 3 simultaneous reasons. Intestinal absorption of magnesium decreases with age. The kidneys become less efficient at retaining magnesium rather than excreting it. And the most common medications in this age group, proton pump inhibitors and diuretics, actively reduce magnesium levels. Magnesium is not simply another mineral. It is a co-actor for more than 600 enzymatic reactions in the human body. Among them, the tyrosine kinase activity of the insulin receptor, without which glucose cannot enter the cell, even when there's sufficient insulin. The function of AMP itself, which requires magnesium for its catalytic activity, and the production of ATP in the mitochondria, which occurs entirely with ATP in the form of MMG-ATP complex. When magnesium is low, all of these processes run at half capacity, and the morning window of autophagy and cellular renewal is wasted every single day. The next piece of research was even more striking. In May 2025, a meta-analysis was published in the journal Nutrients that analyzed 27 publications involving a total of 95,933 people. The objective was to determine whether dietary intake or blood levels of magnesium are associated with the risk of metabolic syndrome. Metabolic syndrome is the cluster of abdominal obesity, high blood pressure, elevated blood glucose, high triglycerides, and low HDL. The combination that predicts risk of type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and certain cancers. The finding was unambiguous. People with the highest magnesium intake had a relative risk of metabolic syndrome of 0.79 compared to those with the lowest intake, a 21% reduction. The randomized controlled trials included in the meta-analysis showed reductions in the HOM-IR index, which is a standard measure of insulin resistance, a reduction in systolic blood pressure of 4.18 MeV in mercury and diastolic of 2.27 MeV and mercury, improvement in HDL cholesterol and reduction in total cholesterol. 4 millimeters of mercury in systolic pressure might not sound impressive, but cardiovascular epidemiology tells us that a reduction of that magnitude in systolic pressure at the population level translates to a decrease of between 6 and 12% in stroke rates. That is not a small number. Hold on to that, because in a few minutes I'm going to connect magnesium to the third element of the protocol, and you'll see why the combination is specifically more powerful than any one of the 3 individually. Let's talk about what your kidneys are doing while you sleep, and why the water you drink in the first minutes of your morning can determine the rate of deterioration over the next decade. Every year that passes after 40, the glomerular filtration rate, which is the measure of how well the kidneys filter blood, declines by approximately 1 ml per minute per 173 square meters of body surface. To put that in plain terms, the kidneys of a 60-year-old filter blood at a noticeably slower pace than those of a 40-year-old, and those of a 70-year-old slower still. That is the normal trajectory of renal aging, not disease, but it creates a cumulative vulnerability. The kidneys have a function that most people don't know about beyond waste filtration. They are the primary organ responsible for regenerating the bicarbonate the body consumes each day, managing its acid load. Normal metabolism produces acids from multiple sources. The carbon dioxide that converts to carbonic acid, acids from protein catabolism, lactic acid from exercise. The body has buffer systems to manage that load, and bicarbonate is the main extracellular buffer. The kidneys regenerate it constantly. As the kidneys age and filter more slowly, this bicarbonate regeneration becomes less efficient. The result is what nephrologists call metabolic acidosis, a state in which blood bicarbonate falls below 22 ml equivalents per liter. Frank metabolic acidosis affects approximately 40% of patients with stage 4 chronic kidney disease. But even subcritical metabolic acidosis, where bicarbonate is in the low normal range, has documented consequences. It accelerates loss of muscle mass by promoting protein catabolism, accelerates bone demineralization because bone releases calcium and phosphate to act as a buffer, and creates a systemic environment with implications we're about to reach. In 2009, Ayandi Brito Ashurst and colleagues published in the Journal of the American Society of Nephrology a randomized controlled trial that has proven to be one of the most impactful findings in preventive nephrology in the last 2 decades. They studied 134 patients with advanced chronic kidney disease and documented metabolic acidosis, dividing them into 2 groups. One group received oral sodium bicarbonate supplementation. The other continued with standard care. After 2 years, the results were dramatic. The rate of kidney function decline in the control group was 5.93 ml per minute per year. In the bicarbonate group, it was 1.88 milliliters per minute per year, a difference of more than 68% in progression speed. The risk of reaching dialysis or transplant was 87% lower in the bicarbonate group, 87%. The 2024 KDIGO Guidelines for Chronic Kidney Disease. The International Nephrology Reference Guidelines now explicitly recommend treating metabolic acidosis with oral alkali when serum bicarbonate falls below 22 ml equivalent per liter. The mechanism researchers identified goes beyond simple acid neutralization. By reducing the acid load that renal tubules must manage, you reduce the tubular interstitial inflammation that sits at the center of chronic kidney disease progression. Now I want to clarify something with precision, because it matters for understanding this protocol's boundaries. The DETOR study was conducted in patients with established chronic kidney disease and documented metabolic acidosis. It was not conducted in healthy 50-year-olds. The extrapolation to adults without a kidney diagnosis is biologically plausible from the mechanism, but it has not been demonstrated in randomized controlled trials with the same rigor. What does have broader evidence, including in people without kidney disease, is citrate. And that brings us to the third element of the trio. Citrate, specifically potassium citrate and the citrate naturally present in fresh lemon juice, has an evidence profile that few compounds can match for renal protection. The Cochrane collaboration, the gold standard for medical evidence synthesis, published a review of 7 randomized controlled trials with 477 participants, examining the use of citrate salts to prevent recurrence of calcium kidney stones. The results: citrate salts reduce the risk of new stone formation with a relative risk of 0.2424. A 76% reduction with statistical heterogeneity of 0 across studies, meaning the effect was consistent regardless of which citrate was used, which institution ran the study, and which population participated. But citrate does something beyond stone prevention, and this is what most health content misses. Citrate directly inhibits the nucleation and growth of calcium crystals in the urine. When the kidney is under chronic acid load, as occurs in low-grade metabolic acidosis, calcium and oxalate crystals form more easily because an acidic urinary pH reduces calcium solubility. Urinary citrate acts as a chelating agent. It binds to calcium before it can precipitate, keeping it in solution and protecting both the urinary tract and renal tissue from the chronic micro-injury caused by crystals. The citrate in lemon juice works through this same mechanism. The juice of half a lemon contains approximately 90 to 100 ml equivalents of free citrate. The liver metabolizes part of it. Citrate enters the citric acid cycle and its metabolism generates bicarbonate as a byproduct. So lemon juice does 2 things simultaneously. It delivers citrate directly protective at the renal level, and it contributes to the systemic alkalinizing load. The American Neurological Association includes potassium citrate in its guidelines as standard treatment for prevention of recurrent calcium stones with grade B evidence. Now, we've reached the part of this topic that requires the most care and the greatest precision. The title of this video includes the phrase "cancer starves." I'm going to explain exactly what that phrase means in scientific terms, what evidence exists, and where the honest limits of that evidence lie, because I believe what isn't said matters as much as what is. In 1924, German biochemist Otto Warburg described what oncologists now call the Warburg effect. Cancer cells, even when there is abundant oxygen available, preferentially use glycolysis, the primitive, inefficient metabolic pathway, rather than mitochondrial respiration. This generates massive quantities of lactic acid and protons that the cancer cell expels outward. The result is that the microenvironment surrounding the tumor, the space between tumor cells and surrounding tissue, becomes profoundly acidic with pH values between 6.22 and 6.8 compared to the normal physiological pH of 7.35 to 7.45. This is not an accident, it is an adaptive advantage the tumor has developed. The acidic microenvironment does several things that favor tumor survival. It suppresses the function of T lymphocytes, the immune cells that most effectively kill cancer cells. It neutralizes certain chemotherapy drugs that are pH sensitive before they can reach the tumor tissue. It promotes angiogenesis, the formation of new blood vessels that feed the tumor. And it facilitates tissue invasion because the acidic pH activates enzymes that degrade the surrounding extracellular matrix. A review published in Biology from NDPI in March 2024 catalogs the evidence on tumor acidity, and the conclusion is clear. Tumor microenvironment acidification is not simply a passive consequence of cancer metabolism. It is an active mechanism that tumors exploit to create a niche favorable to their growth and resistant to the host defenses. The hypothesis that follows from this is conceptually elegant. If alkalizing agents could increase the pH of the tumor microenvironment, they could interfere with several of these advantages. Immune systems could recover some of their activity. Chemotherapy drugs could be more effective, invasion could be reduced. This hypothesis has experimental support in cell cultures and animal models, and it is now beginning to generate human data, preliminary but real. A study published in Anti-Cancer Research in 2020 conducted by Hamaguchi, Narui, and Wada in Japan retrospectively examined 28 patients with metastatic or recurrent pancreatic cancer receiving chemotherapy. Patients were classified by their urinary pH, which served as a proxy for their systemic alkalization status. Patients with urinary pH greater than 7.0, who received an alkalization intervention, including an alkaline diet, oral sodium bicarbonate between 3 and 5 grams daily, and sodium citrate had a median survival of 16.1 months. Patients with low urinary pH had a median survival of 4.7 months. I need to be absolutely transparent about what that data means and what it does not mean. This is a retrospective study with 28 patients. It has no randomized control group. Patients who successfully alkalized may have had better baseline health status, which could explain both the better alkalization and the better survival independently. We cannot establish causality from this design. The authors themselves are careful in their interpretation. What we can honestly say is this: the biological plausibility is solid, grounded in decades of research on the Warburg effect. The mechanisms by which an alkalinized pH could disadvantage the tumor microenvironment are known and specific, and there are clinical trials currently underway to test this rigorously. The clinical trials Gov Industry document NCTO 480, which studies sodium bicarbonate as adjuvant therapy in oncology. The results of those trials will determine whether this intervention earns a formal place in clinical oncology. What I cannot say and won't say is that drinking water with baking soda cures cancer. That would be scientifically dishonest and potentially dangerous. What I can say is that modulation of systemic pH through oral alkalizing agents is an active area of research with established biological mechanisms with initial signals in humans that justify the ongoing trials, and with a known safety profile when used at appropriate doses. If you're under oncology treatment and this interests you, the right conversation is with your oncologist. Some oncology teams are already familiar with the tumor pH literature and can guide you on whether it makes sense in your specific case and how to coordinate it with your treatment. Stay with me because the protocol I'm about to share pulls all of these together in a way that takes under 5 minutes every morning. Once I understood how these three elements function, the hydration that stops the excess cortisol, the magnesium that fuels the EMPK window, and the citrate and bicarbonate that protect the kidney and modulate systemic pH. Once I understood that these three systems don't operate in silos, but as an interconnected network, what surprised me most was how simple the intervention actually is. Think about your kidneys as a filtration plant that has been running non-stop for 50, 60, or 70 years. Every acid your metabolism produces is work for that plant. When you drink water with citrate and a small amount of bicarbonate in the morning, you're pre-neutralizing part of that acid load before it even arrives at the plant. You're reducing the workload of a system that has been running at full capacity for decades. With less acid load to process, there's less tubular inflammation, less micro-injury, and a slower renal aging trajectory. Think about magnesium as the oil in an engine with 600 moving parts. Your engine can keep running with low oil, but every part generates more friction, more heat, more wear. The insulin receptor doesn't signal well. EMPK can activate cellular cleanup efficiently. Mitochondria produce less ATP per molecule of glucose. The engine runs, but it deteriorates faster than it needs to. And think about the morning AMPK window. As the cleanup crews shift before construction begins every morning, while you're in a fasted state and is active, your body has its best opportunity to perform cellular cleaning to maintain stem cells in good condition to eliminate misfolded proteins before they accumulate in quantities that cause damage. When breakfast arrives and motor activates, construction begins and cleanup ends. The question is, did you use that window? Did you have the magnesium available to run at full capacity during those critical minutes? With all of that established, let's get to what you actually do. Before I share the protocol, I need to reiterate something with the same clarity I mentioned at the start. Everything I'm about to share is intended as evidence-based general wellness support. It is not a replacement for any treatment you're already following. If you have chronic kidney disease, stage 3 or higher, heart disease with a sodium restriction, congestive heart failure, or take medications such as digoxin, lithium, potassium-sparing diuretics, or certain antibiotics, there are important modifications you need to discuss with your doctor before beginning any of these interventions. I'll detail those considerations precisely after the protocol. The complete protocol is prepared in a glass of 400 to 500 milliliters of room temperature water. Temperature matters slightly. Cold water can induce mildness of agial spasm and slows gastric emptying, reducing absorption speed. Not a critical factor, but room temperature or slightly warm is preferable. Drink it within the first 10 to 15 minutes of waking, before coffee, before breakfast, and before any medication, unless your doctor has specifically instructed you to take it on an empty stomach. The first component is the juice of half a fresh lemon. Half a lemon provides approximately 90 to 100 ml equivalents of free citrate. That citrate has two primary destinations in the body. Part of it passes to the kidney and appears in the urine as urinary citrate, the agent that inhibits calcium crystal formation. Another part is metabolized by the liver, where citrate enters the citric acid cycle and its metabolism generates bicarbonate as a byproduct. So lemon juice does two things simultaneously. It delivers citrate directly protective at the renal level, and it contributes to the systemic alkalinizing load. A practical detail that follow-up studies in kidney stone prevention have identified. Bottled pasteurized lemon juice contains significantly less active citrate than fresh juice. Pasteurization and storage reduce citrate content. If you use lemon, make it fresh squeezed in the moment. Use a straw to drink the lemon water and rinse your mouth with plain water afterward. The acidity of lemon transiently softens dental enamel, and brushing immediately after can damage it. Wait 30 minutes before brushing. The second component is 1 to 4 teaspoons of pure food grade baking soda sodium bicarbonate, which equals approximately 1 g. That provides 12 ml equivalents of bicarbonate and 19 mg of sodium, representing approximately 5% of the recommended daily sodium limit of 200-300 mg. For normal-ensive adults without a prescribed sodium restriction, that quantity is completely safe and has minimal impact on total daily sodium load. Baking soda reacts with the citric acid from the lemon and produces carbon dioxide, creating a mild effervescence. Some people prefer to add the baking soda to the water first, stir to dissolve, and then add the lemon. Others add everything together and enjoy the fizz. The biochemical result is the same. Use pure sodium bicarbonate without additives. There are commercial antacid formulations containing bicarbonate that include other compounds. That's not what you're looking for here. The third component is magnesium. Several options exist with different absorption profiles and tolerability. Magnesium glycinate is the best tolerated gastrointestinally and has good bioavailability. Magnesium citrate has the additional advantage of contributing to the citrate load as well. Two benefits in one. Although at higher doses it can have a laxative effect. Magnesium oxide is the cheapest and most commonly sold form in pharmacies, but has the worst absorption, less than 4% bioavailability, and therefore the least real-world benefit. The starting dose is 150 to 200 mg of elemental magnesium, which generally corresponds to 1 or 2 capsules depending on the formulation. If you tolerate it well after a week, you can advance to 300 mg. The tolerable upper intake level for supplemental magnesium in adults is set at 350 mg per day by the Food and Nutrition Board of the Institute of Medicine. This limit refers to magnesium from supplements, not dietary magnesium, which has no established upper limit because excess is readily excreted. The signal that you're taking too much is simple loose stools or diarrhea. If that happens, reduce the dose. After more than a decade analyzing how people actually implement changes like this, I've identified the most common failure patterns, and I want to give you the shortcuts that avoid them. The first mistake is starting with maximum doses on day 1. Magnesium at high doses causes gastrointestinal discomfort in people who aren't adapted to it, and that discomfort leads them to abandon the intervention entirely. Start with half your target dose for the first week. The second mistake is keeping the lemon on busy days but still taking the bicarbonate. Without the citrate from lemon, bicarbonate remains useful but you lose the direct renal protective effect of citrate. Squeezing half a lemon takes 3 minutes. It's worth not skipping. The third mistake is adding this to a breakfast you eat immediately afterward. Temp window requires at least 20 to 30 minutes between the water and your first food. If you drink the water and 5 minutes later you're eating a bowl of oatmeal, the autophagy benefit is substantially reduced. The protocol works best when there's a margin of at least 20 minutes between the water and breakfast. The fourth mistake is expecting results in 48 hours. Urinary citrate rises within 1 to 2 days. Serum magnesium may normalize in 1 to 4 weeks if there's a deficit. Blood pressure effects in clinical trials emerge at 12 weeks. Kidney function benefits are trajectories of months to years. This is a long-term investment protocol, not a quick fix. On the foods that complement this protocol, the dietary citrate sources that most consistently raise urinary citrate in the studies are fresh citrus fruits, especially lemon, orange, and grapefruit, kiwi, and to a lesser extent, tomatoes, not processed juices, fresh fruit or freshly squeezed juice. The best absorbed dietary sources of magnesium are pumpkin seeds, which have a high magnesium concentration per gram. Dark leafy greens like cooked spinach and chard, because heat breaks down the oxalate that interferes with absorption. Nuts, particularly almonds and cashews, pure cacao and beans and legumes generally. Dark chocolate with a cacao percentage above 70 contains relevant amounts of magnesium, along with the additional benefit of cacao polyphenols on endothelial function.